The land stretched wide as a hymn at twilight, the sky a bruised canvas, streaked with purple and gold where the sun dragged its weary crown behind the hills. Ezekiel Holloway rode slow, a man bent not only in his saddle but in his spirit, the weight of squandered fortune and restless years pulling on him heavier than the dust settling into the creases of his coat. His horse snorted, tired of the journey, but Zeke pressed on, eyes fixed on the line where the earth met the fading light. A man without roots is little more than a ghost, he thought, and he had paid every last coin to tether himself at last to a patch of ground he could call his own. When the farm first appeared on the horizon, it looked less like promise than penance. The fence post sagged as if ashamed to stand upright. The gate hung crooked, a mournful hinge groaning as he pushed through. The farmhouse sat hunched, windows dark and hollow like the sockets of a skull. Grass had grown in wild, thirsty tufts, clawing through the dirt yard, as though nature had been reclaiming what man had abandoned. Yet for all its ruin, Zeke felt the small stir of a second chance within him, like a match not yet struck, but waiting for a hand. He dismounted, boots meeting soil that would now answer to him, whether it loved him back or not. Inside the house, the air was stale, carrying the scent of dust, mildew, and forgotten time. His footsteps sent shivers through the warped floorboards. The silence pressed in on him, too deep, too certain, as though the place remembered sorrow and would not let it go. He lit a lamp, its glow trembling across cracked walls, and told himself he could mend this. He had mended worse, though the things he had once tried to mend were not made of wood and stone but flesh and trust, and both had slipped away. He turned next to the barn, thinking only of feed, of tack, of shelter for the horse that had carried him across miles of emptiness. The doors resisted, swollen from long neglect, but at last gave way with a shriek that startled a flock of doves from the rafters. Dust swirled in the dimness, thick as breath, and for a moment he saw nothing but shadows stretched against beams. Then his gaze caught on a shape that did not belong to timber or hay. She hung there, suspended in a silence that felt ancient. The rope creaked gently with the weight of her, and for a heartbeat Zeke thought he stood among the dead. Her body was long, taller than any woman he had ever known, her head slumped forward, hair veiling her face in strands of chestnut dull with dust. The lamplight wavered across her frame, and he saw the pale curve of her arm, the bare toes that brushed against the barn floor as though they had been reluctant to leave the earth. His breath caught sharp in his chest. The world slowed, soundless but for the steady throb of his own heart. The rope groaned again, a sound too human, and he realized the body moved not only from the draft, but from the faintest rise of her chest. She was alive. Zeke's hands trembled as he fumbled for his knife. The blade sawed against the coarse rope, his every movement urgent but deliberate. Like a prayer he dared not rush. The strand snapped at last, and she collapsed against him, heavier than he imagined, her long limbs folding awkwardly into his arms. He lowered her gently to the ground, breath scraping shallow through her lips, her skin cold against his palms. He muttered words without knowing it, half curses, half pleas, as he dragged her out from beneath the beams into fresher air. She did not wake. Her eyelids fluttered, but her body hung in that fragile space between surrender and return. Zeke hauled her inside the house, his own strength straining, and laid her upon a cot covered in dust but sound enough to bear her. He fetched water, wetting a rag and pressing it to her lips, watching as a drop slid past her mouth to her throat. Slowly, her chest rose a little fuller. He stayed by her side long into the night, feeding her sips of water, covering her with a blanket he found folded in a chest. She stirred, groaned once, then fell still again. By dawn, his horse whinnied restless outside, and the rancher himself sat slouched by her bedside, exhaustion closing his eyes at last. When he woke, the lamp had burned low, and a young hand was resting faintly atop his own. He looked down to see her eyes half open, green as the edges of spring grass, staring at him with the bewilderment of one returned from a long, strange road. They did not speak. She moved her hand away, pulling the blanket tighter, gaze sliding to the wall, as if ashamed to be seen. Zeke stood, awkward in his own skin, not knowing whether to apologize or reassure. He only nodded, fetched another cup of water, and set it near her. Her fingers, still trembling, curled around the tin, and she drank slow, the sound of her swallowing loud in the small room. It was then the creak of a saddle drifted in from the yard. Zeke stepped outside, blinking against the brightness of day, and saw Silas Boone at the fence, a smirk twisting the young man's face. "Thought I saw you dragging something into the house last night," Silas called, voice thick with curiosity. "Heard tell this place was haunted. Guess you found yourself the ghost." "Go on home," Zeke answered, voice low but steady. Silas chuckled, tipped his hat, and rode off. Yet Zeke knew the damage was already loose in the wind. Gossip was a wildfire in towns like this, spreading quick and burning hotter than truth ever could. By sundown, every whispering mouth would know that the hollow-eyed rancher had carried a strange, too-tall woman into his house. Days passed like this. She lay resting, recovering, while he mended fence posts and hauled water, returning always to her side with a basin, with bread, with silence. She said nothing, but her eyes followed him sometimes, a flicker of recognition growing where once there was only despair. One evening, by the lamplight, her gaze caught his, and he felt time stretch thin between them. There were no words, but something softer than speech seemed to pass across the space. Gratitude, fragile and unspoken. It was in that fragile silence that Sheriff Tobias Crane appeared. The knock on the door was heavy, no room for courtesy. Zeke opened it to find the lawman standing stiff in his long coat, eyes narrowing as he peered past the rancher's shoulder into the room. "Heard you've got company," the sheriff said. Zeke's jaw tightened. "Not company. Just someone needed help." "Help's one thing," Crane said, voice slow as a warning. "But harboring trouble's another. Folks are uneasy. They don't know what kind of woman you've got in there. Big as she is, some say unnatural. You'd best think on what you're bringing down on yourself." Zeke did not move from the doorway. The sheriff stared hard, waiting for him to yield, but Zeke held his ground. At last, Crane spat into the dust, tugged his hat lower, and walked back to his horse. That night, Zeke sat once more by the cot, staring at the slow rise and fall of her chest. He thought of the whispers now circling town, the suspicion in the sheriff's eyes, the loneliness of this house doubled by the strangeness of his guest. And yet when her eyes opened again in the half-light, searching his face, he felt none of the shame the world would heap upon him, only the weight of a choice. To turn from her and walk back into solitude, or to stand with her in the shadow of whatever storm came next. The match he had carried unstruck in his chest flickered faintly then, catching, uncertain but alive. He did not yet know if it would burn bright enough to guide them through. But in that quiet room, with the night pressing close and the town already sharpening its judgment, Ezekiel Holloway knew he would not let her fall again. Morning broke softer on the farm than it had in weeks, the sun rising through a haze of pale gold, dew shimmering across the wild grass like a veil laid over tired ground. Ezekiel Holloway stepped out with a bucket of feed, the sound of hens fussing in their coop filling the stillness. He looked toward the barn instinctively, though the charred rope and memory of her swaying shape still haunted him like a ghost at the edge of his vision. But inside the house now, she stirred with life, no longer only the shadow he had cut down. Clara May had begun to move about, though each step carried the hesitation of someone uncertain whether she had the right to take up space. She towered over the kitchen's low beams, ducking as though apologizing for her very height. She said little, but she worked, her hands folding sheets, stacking wood, patching what she could find broken. And Zeke, though he kept his words close, found that her silence was not emptiness, but a kind of language, one that spoke of endurance, of the strength it takes to keep living when the world had tried to unmake you. One evening, he came in from mending fence to find her at the table with a lantern lit, her long fingers threading twine through a broken chair seat. She glanced up, green eyes bright in the wavering glow, and for the first time her lips parted in sound. "I used to do this at home," she said, voice low and rough, like a riverbed long dry. Zeke stopped in the doorway, startled by the gift of her words. "You from around here?" She shook her head. "Further north. Not much left there worth saying." He did not press. Instead, he fetched a kettle, set it on the stove, and filled the silence with the crackle of kindling. Yet her voice lingered in the room even after it fell quiet again, the way music lingers in the bones long after the last note has been struck. Days stretched, measured not in conversations, but in gestures. Zeke passing her a tool as they worked on the fence. Clara setting aside the larger portion of bread for him, without comment. Their hands brushing once while lifting a crate. Both of them pulling back quick as if stung, yet carrying the moment within them the rest of the day. One night, as the wind rose and the fire in the stove snapped, she spoke again. I was a girl once, though no one ever believed it. Always too tall, too broad, too much. Her gaze fixed on the flames, not him. My father said folks would never see me as anything but a mistake. People laughed, spat, called me things I won't repeat. One day I believed them. That's when I took the rope. Zeke did not answer at once. He sat across from her, shadows drawing long between them, then said quietly, Sometimes folks hang their own shame around your neck and tell you it's yours. Doesn't mean you have to wear it. She turned her eyes on him, sharp with surprise, as if the thought had never been offered to her before. And though no more words passed that night, something shifted. The silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a bridge. Outside their walls, the town's whispers grew. Silas Boone, eager for attention, filled the saloon with tales of the giantess hiding out on Holloway's land. Some laughed, some frowned, and some carried the talk home where it grew like weeds. Sheriff Crane came once more, his boots heavy on the porch, his voice clipped. Zeke, he said, eyes narrowing at the glimpse of Clara through the doorway. You're stirring up unease. Folks don't take kindly to the unnatural. Best you let her move on before trouble finds its way here. But Zeke only shook his head. She ain't trouble. She's flesh and bone like the rest of us. The sheriff's jaw worked, but he said nothing more, only spat in the dirt and left. Clara, who had been listening, folded her arms across her chest as though bracing for a blow. Yet when she looked at Zeke, she found him steady, his gaze unyielding. For the first time, she saw in another's eyes not pity or ridicule, but the quiet certainty that she was worth standing beside. That night she wept silently into the blanket, not from sorrow, but from the strange, painful relief of it. The storm broke not in rain but in fire. It came on a windless night, the stars scattered bright and careless above, when Silas Boone crept to the barn with a bottle and a spark. By the time the smoke reached Zeke's nose, flames had already taken the rafters. He ran, shouting, his heart pounding as he heard the horses screaming within. He pulled at the door, the heat searing his hands, but the inferno pushed him back. Clara was there before thought could catch him. She seized a trough of water, flung it wide, and shouldered into the blaze. Her frame moved through the smoke, like a pillar carved of firelight, her hands tearing open the stalls. One by one, the animals fled into the night air. Zeke followed her in, choking, dragging a calf by its halter, until the smoke wrapped tight around his lungs and dropped him to his knees. Through the haze, he saw her reach for him. Arms strong as timber lifted him, carried him clear of the barn as if he weighed no more than a sack of grain. She set him down in the dirt, her chest heaving, her face streaked with ash. Then she turned back, bucket after bucket of water flying from her hands, until the fire, starved and beaten, gave up its hold on what remained. By dawn, the barn was half a skeleton, smoke curling from its bones. The townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the glow and shouts in the night. They stood silent now, watching the woman they had whispered against, her hair wild, her skin smeared with soot, but her eyes alive with something fierce and undeniable. She saved him. Someone murmured. She saved the stock. Another added. Silas Boone, pale and tight-lipped, tried to slip away, but Sheriff Crane's hand caught his shoulder. The sheriff's gaze, once filled with suspicion, lingered on Clara, and a flicker of respect softened the lines of his face. Zeke, his lungs raw, leaned against the fence and looked at her. Their eyes met across the wreckage, and though no words were spoken, both knew that something irrevocable had taken root between them. She had carried him from the fire, but more than that, she had carried herself from the noose the world had hung on her long ago. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt, The barn rose again, plank by plank, hammer strokes ringing out steady as a heartbeat. Clara worked beside him, her hands blistered but uncomplaining, her laughter quiet, surprising, sometimes breaking free when a beam slipped or a nail bent. The town, once cold, began to bring offerings, a coil of rope, a sack of feed, timber hauled in by wagon. Gossip turned to gratitude, suspicion to quiet admiration. Still, the bond between Zeke and Clara grew not in declarations, but in the small mercies of daily life. His hand steadying a ladder while she climbed, her tucking an apple into his coat pocket before he left for town. 2 mugs set out by the fire, always side by side. Their closeness did not clamor for the world to see, but it shone in every unspoken gesture, a warmth deeper than any word could name. One evening, as the rebuilt barn stood tall against the setting sun, Zeke leaned on the fence, Clara beside him. The air smelled of hay and earth, the sky wide and endless overhead. "You ever think on what might have been?" she said softly. "If you hadn't come to that barn that night?" He looked at her, the light catching in her green eyes, and answered with the steadiness of a vow. "Then the world would have been the poorer for it." She turned her gaze away, a smile flickering at her lips, small and shy but filled with a strength that had been buried too long. And in that moment, Ezekiel Holloway knew that whatever storm still waited, whatever scars the world might press upon them, they would stand together, not as ghosts haunted by shame, but as souls who had found in each other the quiet grace of belonging. For the land had not saved him, nor the fortune he once squandered. What had saved him was the act of cutting another soul free from the rope, and choosing, day after day, to hold fast when the world would rather let go. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself walking through the lonesome plains of judgment, when voices whisper your worth is too small or your shape too strange, remember this: salvation does not always come in thunder or gold. Sometimes it comes in silence, in a steady hand, in the courage to stand beside another when all others turn away. Sometimes it comes in the ember that refuses to die, even in the ashes of fire.